Kenna Voss had perfected the art of invisibility long before she arrived at Roosevelt High School. In the corridors of military bases, from Fort Bragg to Ramstein Air Base, she had learned that the safest way to navigate the constant upheaval of military life was to blend seamlessly into whatever environment she found herself in. Her slight frame, barely 5'4" and weighing perhaps 115 pounds soaking wet, made this easier than it might have been for someone more physically imposing. But it wasn't just her size that allowed her to disappear into crowds. It was a practiced skill, honed through years of being the new kid, the outsider, the one who would inevitably be moving on just when she started to feel settled. At Roosevelt High School in Denver, Colorado, Kenna moved through the hallways like a specter, her presence so understated that teachers sometimes forgot to mark her attendance even when she was sitting right there in the front row. She had a way of positioning herself that drew no attention. Never the first to arrive in class, never the last to leave, always somewhere in that comfortable middle ground where no one noticed her coming or going. Her dark hair, the color of rich coffee beans, fell in gentle waves that she deliberately allowed to curtain her face, creating a barrier between herself and the world that seemed to press in from all sides. The oversized sweaters she favored were a carefully chosen uniform of anonymity. Soft grays, muted blues, and faded blacks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They hung loosely on her frame, disguising the lean muscle that came from years of staying in shape, according to military standards her father had instilled in her. To her classmates, she might have looked fragile, perhaps even undernourished, but beneath those shapeless layers was a body that could run 5 miles without breaking a sweat and do push-ups until her arms gave out from fatigue rather than lack of strength. What none of her fellow students could have recognized, lacking the trained eye to see it, was that Kenna carried herself with the subtle but unmistakable bearing of someone who had been raised in a world where situational awareness was not just encouraged, but required for survival. When she entered a classroom, her dark eyes would perform a quick but thorough sweep, noting the positions of every exit, cataloging the faces of her classmates, identifying potential threats or allies with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had learned these habits in environments where such vigilance could mean the difference between safety and danger. Her hands, when she thought no one was looking, stayed loose and ready at her sides, not the clenched fists of someone perpetually angry or afraid, but the relaxed readiness of someone who had been taught that tension could slow reaction time. When she sat down, it was always with her back to a wall when possible, always where she could see the door, always positioned so that she could move quickly if the situation demanded it. These were not the behaviors of paranoia, but of training, ingrained so deeply that they had become as natural as breathing. The transition to Roosevelt High had been particularly difficult, even by Kenna's standards. Her father, Master Sergeant Thomas Voss, had received orders for a new assignment that would take him to a classified location for an extended deployment. For the first time in her 17 years, Kenna would not be accompanying him. Instead, she had been sent to live with her grandmother in Denver, a woman she barely knew despite sharing her blood. The decision had been practical rather than emotional. Kenna needed stability for her senior year, needed to graduate from a single school rather than being shuffled from one military base to another as her father's career demanded. But practical didn't make it any easier. Her grandmother's house in suburban Denver felt alien after a lifetime of military base housing. The rooms were too big, too quiet, filled with furniture that had been in the same place for decades. There were no réveillé calls to wake her, no sound of jets overhead, no sense of organized purpose that had defined every place she had ever lived. Instead, there was just the strange silence of civilian life, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Her grandmother, Margaret Voss, was a kind woman in her 70s who had spent most of her adult life trying to understand the military world that had claimed first her son and then her granddaughter. She did her best to make Kenna feel welcome, preparing elaborate dinners and asking careful questions about school, but there was an awkwardness between them that neither quite knew how to bridge. Margaret had lived in the same house for 43 years, had shopped at the same grocery store for 2 decades, knew her neighbors by name and their children's birthdays. To her, the idea of moving every 2 or 3 years seemed not just difficult, but incomprehensible. "You must be excited to finally put down roots," she had said during Kenna's first week in Denver, meaning it kindly, but not understanding how the words landed. Roots were something Kenna had never learned to want or expect. Home, to her, was wherever her family happened to be stationed, and the concept of permanence felt more threatening than comforting. The students at Roosevelt High existed in a world that was completely foreign to Kenna's experience. They complained about parents who had lived in the same house their entire childhood, groaned about summer jobs at businesses their families had patronized for generations, and planned for college with the assumption that they would return home for every holiday and break. They talked about kindergarten friendships that had lasted 12 years, about teachers who had taught their older siblings, about traditions and inside jokes that stretched back to middle school or beyond. Kenna listened to these conversations with the detached interest of an anthropologist, studying a culture she could observe but never truly join. She had never attended the same school for more than 3 consecutive years. Her longest friendship had lasted 18 months before her father's transfer to a new base had ended it with promises to stay in touch that had gradually faded into silence. The idea of knowing someone since childhood, of having shared experiences that stretched back years, was as foreign to her as if her classmates had been describing life on another planet. 3 months into the school year, she had managed to establish a routine that felt sustainable, if not comfortable. She arrived at school precisely 7 minutes before the first bell, enough time to navigate to her locker and gather her materials without rushing, but not so early that she would have to make conversation with classmates who arrived even earlier. She ate lunch alone, always at the same corner table in the cafeteria, always with a book open in front of her as both entertainment and shield. She participated in class discussions only when directly called upon, and even then, her responses were precise and minimal, designed to satisfy the requirement without drawing additional attention. Her academic performance was exemplary but unremarkable in its consistency. She turned in every assignment on time, scored well on every test, and participated just enough to avoid being labeled a problem. Her teachers saw her as a pleasant, intelligent student who caused no trouble and required no special attention. She was the kind of student who could go through an entire semester without a teacher remembering anything specific about her, except that she had been present and prepared. But this carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, in the Roosevelt High cafeteria during what should have been just another unremarkable lunch period. The cafeteria was a study in teenage social dynamics with its invisible but clearly defined territorial boundaries. The athletes claimed the tables near the windows, their varsity jackets and letter sweaters creating a visual barrier that was as effective as any physical rope. The theater kids gathered around the tables closest to the stage, their animated conversations about auditions and opening nights creating a bubble of creative energy. The academically minded students clustered near the library entrance, their conversations a mix of upcoming AP exams and college application deadlines. And then there were the tables, like the one Kenna chose each day. The neutral zones where students who didn't fit neatly into any particular category could eat their lunches without having to navigate complex social hierarchies. Her corner table was positioned perfectly for observation, allowing her to watch the room's dynamics while remaining largely outside them. On this particular Tuesday, Kenna was reading a worn paperback copy of Black Hawk Down. a book she had borrowed from her grandmother's surprisingly extensive collection of military histories. The book's pages were soft from repeated readings, and Kenna found comfort in the familiar weight of it in her hands. She was halfway through a turkey sandwich, the same lunch she brought every day, prepared with military precision the night before, when the familiar voice of Trent Blackwood cut through the cafeteria's ambient noise like a blade. Trent was impossible to ignore, even when he wasn't actively trying to draw attention. At 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle earned through 4 years of varsity football, he moved through Roosevelt High like he owned not just the building, but the ground it stood on. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes always perfectly fitted, and his smile always perfectly calibrated to charm adults while intimidating his peers. He was the kind of young man who had never questioned his place in the world because that place had always been at the top of whatever hierarchy he found himself in. "Look at little army girl over there." Trent's voice carried easily across the cafeteria, pitched just loud enough to ensure that surrounding tables could hear every word. "Still eating alone, I see. What's that book about this time? How to Make Friends and Influence People." He delivered the line with the timing of someone who had spent years perfecting his ability to wound with words, and the laughter from his table came right on cue. Jake Morrison and Drew Sullivan flanked Trent like bookends, their positions at the table as carefully orchestrated as everything else about their group dynamic. Jake was built like a linebacker, which he was, with arms that strained the seams of his letter jacket and a neck that seemed too thick for his head. His laugh was loud and braying, the kind that could silence conversations 3 tables away. Drew was leaner, but no less intimidating, with the kind of sharp features and cold eyes that suggested a meanness that went deeper than simple teenage cruelty. Kenna's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the edges of her book, but she didn't look up. This was a tactic she had learned in middle school at Fort Campbell, when a group of older kids had decided that the new girl with the weird military family made an easy target. The key was to deny them the reaction they were seeking, to refuse to play the game by their rules. Bullies fed on response: anger, tears, fear, defiance. It didn't matter what emotion they provoked, as long as they provoked something. Take away that emotional feedback, and most of them eventually moved on to easier targets. But something about her lack of response seemed to irritate Trent rather than discourage him. He was used to getting reactions from people, used to being the center of attention wherever he went. The fact that this quiet girl could simply ignore him felt like a challenge to his authority, a crack in the carefully constructed image he had built for himself. "I'm talking to you," Trent continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several nearby students look up from their own conversations. "It's rude to ignore people when they're trying to be friendly." The word "friendly" dripped with sarcasm so thick that even the most socially oblivious student would have recognized it as anything but. There was something in Trent's tone that suggested this was about more than simple bullying. It was about establishing dominance, about putting this newcomer in her place before she got any ideas about where she belonged in Roosevelt High's carefully ordered social structure. Jake, perhaps sensing that Trent needed support, or perhaps just eager to join in the entertainment, added his own voice to the mix. "Maybe she can't hear us. Maybe she's got those army earplugs in." The comment drew more laughter from their table, the kind of laughter that was less about humor and more about marking territory, establishing who belonged and who didn't. The casual way they mocked military service hit Kenna harder than she had expected. She had grown up surrounded by people who understood the sacrifices that came with military life, who respected the commitment it required, who honored the service of those who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting others. To hear it dismissed so casually, turned into material for cheap jokes, made something hot and angry unfurl in her chest. But she had been taught discipline by experts in the subject, and discipline meant not allowing emotions to dictate actions. She turned a page in her book with deliberate calm, her dark eyes scanning the text without really seeing the words. The movement was calculated to demonstrate that she was not ignoring them out of fear, but out of choice, that their words were so beneath her notice that they weren't worth interrupting her reading. This display of composure only seemed to infuriate Trent further. He was used to being the aggressor, the one who set the terms of every interaction. The fact that this slight, quiet girl could make him feel like he was losing control of the situation by doing absolutely nothing was intolerable. The scrape of his chair against the linoleum floor was loud enough to cut through the cafeteria's background noise, and conversations at nearby tables began to fade as students sensed drama approaching. Trent stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and theatrical, designed to draw attention and establish his dominance over the situation. At his full height, with his broad shoulders and athlete's build, he cut an intimidating figure, and he knew it. As he began walking toward Kenna's table, the cafeteria fell into that particular kind of silence that occurs when teenagers sense conflict brewing. It wasn't complete silence. Conversations continued at distant tables, trays still clattered against tables, the cafeteria workers still called out orders, but in the immediate area around Kenna's table, an expectant hush settled over the students like a blanket. Jake and Drew followed in Trent's wake, their movements coordinated like a pack of predators closing in on isolated prey. They had done this before, Kenna realized, watching their approach with eyes that remained focused on her book but were actually tracking every step they took. This was a practiced routine for them, a familiar dance of intimidation that had probably worked on dozens of other students over the years. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Trent said when he reached her table, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. He was standing directly beside her chair, close enough that his shadow fell across her book, close enough that she could smell his cologne and the faint scent of the protein bars he consumed religiously to maintain his athletic physique. When Kenna still didn't look up, Trent reached out and knocked the book from her hands with a casual backhand that sent it tumbling to the floor. The sound of it hitting the linoleum was sharp and final, and several students at nearby tables visibly winced at the casual destruction of someone else's property. "When someone's trying to be nice," Trent continued, his voice now carrying a note of barely controlled anger, "you should respond. It's called manners. Maybe they don't teach those in the army." For the first time since he had approached her table, Kenna looked up at him. Her dark eyes met his with a steady gaze that was neither fearful nor defiant, but something else entirely. The kind of calm assessment that made Trent suddenly feel like he was being evaluated by someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents than high school bullies. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify, something that made him want to take a step backward, even as his pride demanded that he hold his ground. It wasn't anger or fear or any of the emotions he was used to seeing in the faces of his victims. It was more like the look a soldier might give an enemy position before deciding whether it was worth the ammunition to take it out. "I heard you," Kenna said quietly, her voice carrying a controlled tone that somehow made the words more intimidating than if she had shouted them. Each word was precisely enunciated, delivered with the kind of calm authority that suggested she was choosing to respond rather than being forced to. "I just don't have anything to say to you." The dismissal in her voice was like a slap across Trent's face. He was used to reactions, tears, anger, defiance, even attempts at negotiation, but this calm indifference was something entirely new in his experience. It made him feel smaller, less significant, and that realization filled him with a rage that was partly directed at her and partly directed at himself for caring what this nobody thought of him. Jake and Drew exchanged glances, both of them suddenly uncertain about how this interaction was supposed to proceed. Their role in these situations was usually to provide backup intimidation, to make sure their target felt completely outnumbered and helpless. But something about this girl's composure was throwing off the usual script, making them feel like they were missing something important about the situation they had walked into. "You think you're better than us?" Trent asked, his voice rising enough that students 3 tables away could hear every word. The question came out sharper than he had intended, revealing more of his insecurity than he would have liked. "Just because you're some army brat who moves around all the time doesn't mean you can act like you're too good for this school." The phrase "army brat" was delivered with particular venom, as if Trent had found a weapon he thought might finally pierce her armor. In his limited experience, people were sensitive about their backgrounds, their families, their places in the world. Surely this quiet girl would react to having her military upbringing mocked, would finally give him the emotional response he was seeking. But Kenna simply bent down to retrieve her fallen book, her movements fluid and controlled in a way that suggested either extensive training or natural grace. As she straightened back up, she met Trent's eyes again with that same calm assessment. "I never said I was better than anyone," she replied, her voice still maintaining that same quiet control. "I just want to eat my lunch in peace." It was a reasonable request, delivered in a reasonable tone, but it only seemed to inflame Trent's anger further. The fact that she could remain so composed while he was clearly losing his temper made him feel like she was somehow winning an argument he didn't even realize they were having. Something snapped inside him, some carefully maintained facade of civilized behavior giving way to the raw need to dominate, to humiliate, to prove that he was still in control of this situation. He reached out and swept her lunch tray off the table with a violent motion that sent her sandwich, apple, and small carton of milk flying across the floor. The crash of the tray hitting the linoleum was loud enough to silence conversations throughout the cafeteria. Students who had been pretending not to watch the unfolding drama now turned openly to stare, their faces showing a mixture of shock and fascination at the sudden escalation of violence. "Oops," Trent said with mock innocence, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "Looks like you made a mess. Maybe you should clean that up like a good little soldier." The cafeteria was completely silent now, every student watching to see what would happen next. The lunch ladies had stopped their work behind the serving counter, their faces showing concern, but also uncertainty about whether they should intervene in what appeared to be a student dispute. Even the distant conversations at tables across the room had faded away as word of the confrontation spread. Kenna looked at the scattered remains of her lunch, then back at Trent. For just a moment, something flickered in her dark eyes, a flash of something that made Jake and Drew take an unconscious step backward without really understanding why. It was like seeing a glimpse of lightning in the distance, a warning of the storm that might be approaching. But then the moment passed, and Kenna was simply the quiet new girl again. She stood up slowly, gathered her backpack and her rescued book, and began walking toward the cafeteria exit without a word. She stepped carefully around the scattered food, not because she was afraid of it, but because she refused to give Trent the satisfaction of seeing her step on her own lunch. As she walked away, her stride was different from the hurried shuffle that victims usually employed when retreating from bullies. Instead, she moved with the measured pace of someone who was thinking, calculating, planning their next move, rather than simply running away. Several observant students noticed this difference, though they couldn't have articulated what they were seeing. Trent stood there among the scattered remains of her lunch, holding his victory, but somehow feeling like it had turned to ash in his mouth. He had gotten the reaction he wanted. He had humiliated her in front of the entire cafeteria, had established his dominance and put her in her place. So why did he feel like he had somehow lost this encounter? The scattered laughter from his table sounded forced now, and even Jake and Drew seemed uncertain about whether they should be celebrating. There had been something in that girl's eyes, in the way she had looked at them before walking away, that suggested this was far from over. As the cafeteria slowly returned to its normal rhythm, students began cleaning up the mess and resuming their conversations, but the topic of discussion had shifted. Who was this quiet girl who could remain so composed under such blatant harassment? Where had she learned to project that kind of calm authority? And what did that look in her eyes mean for Trent and his friends? Over the following days and weeks, the incident in the cafeteria seemed to mark the beginning of a campaign rather than an isolated event. Trent appeared to have made targeting Kenna his personal mission, as if her continued refusal to break down was a challenge he couldn't ignore. What had started as casual bullying escalated into something more systematic, more deliberate, and ultimately more dangerous. The harassment followed a pattern that was both sophisticated and subtle enough to avoid detection by the faculty. Trent had learned over his years at Roosevelt High exactly how far he could push before crossing lines that would bring adult intervention, and he stayed carefully within those boundaries while making Kenna's daily life as difficult as possible. In the hallways between classes, when the corridors were crowded with students rushing to their next period, Trent would time his movements to accidentally bump into Kenna. The collisions were always hard enough to send her books flying, to make her stumble, to force her to scramble to gather her materials while other students flowed around her like water around a stone. But they were never quite violent enough to be called assault, never quite obvious enough for a passing teacher to recognize them as anything other than typical teenage clumsiness in overcrowded hallways. The comments came constantly, delivered in a voice just loud enough for Kenna to hear, but just quiet enough that they couldn't be definitively identified as harassment by any adult who might be listening. "Nice job, Army girl," when she struggled to collect her scattered books. "Looking sharp today, cadet," when her hair was disheveled from one of his accidental collisions. "At ease, soldier," when she would stand still for a moment to reorient herself after being knocked off balance. Each comment was designed to remind her that she was different, that she didn't belong, that her military background made her a target rather than something to be respected. Trent had an intuitive understanding of psychological warfare, even if he couldn't have defined the term. He knew that constant low-level harassment could be more damaging than a single violent incident, that the accumulation of small humiliations could break someone down more effectively than any dramatic confrontation. Jake and Drew had fallen into their roles as supporting players with the ease of long practice. They would position themselves strategically around Kenna's locker during the brief passing periods between classes, creating a human barrier that made it difficult for her to access her books without squeezing past them. They never quite blocked her path completely. That would have been too obvious. But they made every interaction unnecessarily uncomfortable and awkward. "Excuse me," Kenna would say politely when she needed to reach her locker, and they would move just enough to allow her passage while making it clear that they were doing her a favor. Their conversations would continue around her as if she didn't exist, discussions of weekend parties she wasn't invited to, inside jokes she couldn't understand, social plans that emphasized her status as an outsider. In the classes they shared with her, the harassment became more subtle but no less effective. They would save seats for friends who never materialized, forcing Kenna to choose between asking them to move their backpacks or sitting in less desirable locations. They would time their own movements to arrive at group workstations just before her, claiming the better spots and leaving her with whatever remained. They would laugh at inside jokes during class discussions, creating moments of shared understanding that highlighted her isolation. The teachers seemed oblivious to what was happening, or perhaps they simply chose not to see it. Mrs. Patterson, who taught advanced placement English literature, would frown slightly when Trent made his subtle comments, but never addressed them directly. She was nearing retirement and had learned to pick her battles carefully, focusing her limited energy on academic rather than social issues. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught American history, actually seemed to think the boys were being friendly when they offered to help Kenna with her books or suggested she join their study groups. He missed entirely the mocking tone in their voices, the way their offers of assistance were designed to make her feel more isolated rather than included. His classroom management style favored maintaining order over investigating interpersonal dynamics, and as long as his students weren't openly disruptive, he was content to let them work out their social issues on their own. The harassment extended beyond the school day and into the digital realm that dominated teenage social life. Kenna had no social media presence, another mark of her military upbringing, where operational security had been drilled into her from childhood, but that didn't protect her from becoming a topic of online discussion among her classmates. Screenshots of her school photos circulated through group chats with mocking captions. "Army girl thinks she's so tough. Who does she think she is? Bet she cries herself to sleep in her little army pajamas." The comments weren't directly sent to her, but they filtered back through the complex network of teenage communication, reaching her ears through whispered conversations and meaningful looks. Someone created a fake social media account in her name, complete with exaggerated military posts and ridiculous claims about her background. The account posted things like, "Just finished my daily 5-mile run in full combat gear and can't wait to practice my sniper skills this weekend," portraying her as either a military obsessive or a dangerous extremist, depending on how charitably one chose to interpret the posts. The fake account was reported and taken down within a few days, but not before it had been screenshot and shared widely enough to become part of the school's digital folklore. Students who had never spoken to Kenna directly now had opinions about her based on posts she had never made, creating a distorted image of her that bore no resemblance to reality, but was impossible for her to correct without drawing even more attention to herself. Through all of this, Kenna maintained the same composed exterior that had characterized her response to the initial cafeteria incident. She arrived at school each day precisely on time, attended all her classes, completed all her assignments, and participated in discussions when called upon. To any casual observer, she appeared to be handling the harassment with remarkable maturity and resilience. But there were signs, visible to those who knew how to look for them, that the constant pressure was taking its toll. Her grandmother noticed that she had begun sleeping poorly, often finding her awake in the early hours of the morning, sitting by her bedroom window and staring out at the quiet suburban street. Margaret would sometimes hear her moving around the house after midnight, checking locks and window latches with the thoroughness of someone conducting a security sweep. Her eating habits, never particularly robust, became even more Spartan. She would prepare her daily turkey sandwich with mechanical precision, but often return home with it barely touched. When her grandmother asked about her appetite, Kenna would explain that she had eaten lunch at school, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Most telling were the subtle changes in her behavior patterns. She began arriving at school later, timing her entrance to minimize the amount of time she spent in the hallways between classes. She started taking different routes between classrooms, even when those routes were longer and more complicated, apparently trying to avoid certain areas where encounters with her tormentors were most likely. But if Trent and his friends thought these changes indicated that their campaign was succeeding, they were misunderstanding what they were seeing. Kenna wasn't retreating out of fear or defeat. She was adapting, learning the terrain, gathering intelligence about her opponent's patterns and weaknesses. Every route change was reconnaissance. Every altered timing was tactical adjustment. She was applying lessons learned in military families to the social battlefield of high school, and she was preparing for something that none of them could have anticipated. It was during this period of escalating harassment that Ms. Elena Vazquez began to take notice of what was happening. Ms. Vazquez was one of the newer faculty members at Roosevelt High. having joined the staff only 2 years earlier after completing her master's degree in education. At 32, she was young enough to remember her own high school experience clearly, but old enough to have gained perspective on the complex social dynamics that governed teenage behavior. Unlike many of her colleagues, Ms. Vazquez had not come to teaching directly from college. She had served 6 years in the United States Army, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan, before using her GI Bill benefits to earn her teaching credentials. Her classroom walls were decorated not only with maps and political posters, but also with subtle reminders of her military service. A small American flag, a challenge coin from her former unit, a photograph of her standing with fellow soldiers in front of a Humvee. She taught advanced placement, government and politics, a class that attracted serious students who were planning careers in law, politics, or public service. Her teaching style reflected her military background, organized, disciplined, and focused on practical applications rather than theoretical discussions. Students who took her class learned not only about the structure of American government, but also about leadership, civic responsibility, and the importance of standing up for principles even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. Ms. Vazquez had been watching the situation with Kenna unfold for several weeks before she decided to intervene. Her military training had taught her to observe before acting, to gather intelligence before making tactical decisions, and what she observed troubled her deeply. She recognized immediately that Kenna was military family. It wasn't just the way she sat up straight in class, or the precision with which she organized her materials, though those were certainly indicators. It was something deeper, the way she scanned the classroom when she entered, the way she positioned herself near exits, the controlled way she moved through spaces as if she were constantly assessing potential threats and escape routes. More importantly, Ms. Vazquez recognized the signs of someone who was under sustained psychological pressure. She had seen similar patterns in soldiers who were dealing with hostile environments or difficult command situations. The careful control, the measured responses, the way Kenna seemed to be constantly calculating her next move. These were coping mechanisms employed by people who were living in a state of constant alertness. What concerned Ms. Vazquez most was her recognition of the behavior patterns exhibited by Trent and his friends. She had seen similar dynamics in military units where leadership had broken down, where stronger individuals targeted weaker ones, not out of any legitimate military purpose, but simply because they could. The systematic nature of the harassment, the way it was designed to stay just below the threshold of obvious misconduct, spoke to a level of sophistication that suggested this was not Trent's first campaign of this type. As a teacher, Ms. Vazquez faced the delicate challenge of addressing the situation without making it worse for Kenna. Direct intervention might embarrass the girl or escalate the conflict in ways that could be counterproductive. But allowing the harassment to continue was equally unacceptable, both morally and professionally. She began by observing more carefully, documenting patterns and incidents that might have been invisible to other faculty members. She noted the timing of accidental collisions in the hallways, the strategic positioning of Trent's group around Kenna's locker, the subtle but consistent pattern of comments and social exclusion that characterized their behavior. More importantly, she began watching Kenna herself, looking for signs of how the constant pressure was affecting her. What she saw worried her. Despite Kenna's outward composure, Ms. Vazquez recognized the signs of someone who was being pushed toward a breaking point. The controlled exterior was holding, but the stress fractures were beginning to show. It was during this period of careful observation that Ms. Vazquez first noticed the leather jacket. Kenna had started wearing it in late October when the Denver weather began to turn cold, and the Rocky Mountains that surrounded the city started to show their first dustings of snow. The jacket was clearly military issue, though not current. The style and color suggested it was from earlier conflicts, possibly dating back to the Iraq War or even earlier operations. The leather was well worn, softened by years of use and countless applications of saddle soap and conditioning oil. It was the kind of jacket that told stories. Stories of long hours on guard duty, of convoy missions through hostile territory, of the kind of experiences that left permanent marks on both equipment and the people who wore it. What struck Ms. Vazquez most about the jacket was the careful way Kenna wore it. This wasn't a fashion statement or an attempt to look tough. The jacket was clearly too large for her slight frame. It hung loosely on her shoulders and the sleeves extended past her wrists. But she wore it with a kind of reverence that suggested it held deep personal significance. Ms. Vazquez could see the faint outlines where patches and insignia had once been attached to the jacket. Military personnel often removed such items when they transitioned to civilian life. But the careful way the patches had been removed, without damaging the underlying leather, suggested that they had been preserved rather than simply discarded. The jacket became another target for Trent's harassment almost immediately. He would make comments about it being too big, about Kenna trying to look tough when she was clearly just compensating for her own insecurities. He would tug on the sleeves when he passed her in the hallway, or grab the collar when she was getting books from her locker. "What's with the costume?" he would ask, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Playing dress-up in Daddy's old military surplus." The comments about the jacket seemed to affect Kenna differently than the other harassment. Ms. Vazquez noticed that her jaw would tighten when Trent mentioned it, that her hands would curl into fists at her sides before she consciously relaxed them. There was something about those specific attacks that cut deeper than the rest, something that suggested the jacket represented more than just clothing to her. Ms. Vazquez began to piece together a picture of what the jacket might mean. Based on its style and condition, it had clearly seen actual military service. The careful way Kenna wore it, the reverent way she handled it, suggested it had belonged to someone important to her, most likely a family member who had served with distinction. The possibility that the jacket had belonged to someone who was no longer alive occurred to Ms. Vazquez, and that thought filled her with both anger and concern. If Trent was unknowingly mocking the memory of someone Kenna had lost, the psychological damage he was inflicting could be far more severe than even he realized. But Ms. Vazquez also recognized something else in Kenna's reaction to the jacket-related harassment. Beneath the controlled exterior, beneath the careful composure, there was anger building. Not the hot, explosive anger of typical teenage conflicts, but the cold, controlled fury of someone who had been trained to channel emotion into action. Ms. Vazquez had seen that kind of anger before, in soldiers who had been pushed beyond their breaking point, but who still maintained enough discipline to control their responses. It was the kind of anger that didn't explode outward in random violence, but instead focused itself with laser-like intensity on specific targets and specific objectives. The realization that Kenna might be approaching her breaking point filled Ms. Vazquez with both concern and anticipation. Concern because she recognized that when someone with military training finally decided to respond to sustained harassment, the results could be far more dramatic than typical high school conflicts, but also anticipation because she suspected that Trent and his friends had no idea what they were actually dealing with, and the lesson they were about to learn might be more educational than they had bargained for. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, on a day when the first serious snow of the season had begun to fall across the Denver metropolitan area. The Rocky Mountains that ringed the city were already white with early winter snow, and the forecast called for several inches of accumulation by evening. Students were excited about the prospect of a weekend snowstorm, the first real taste of the winter sports season that defined much of Colorado's recreational culture. Kenna was walking toward the student parking lot after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her grandfather's leather jacket zipped up against the cold mountain air. She was thinking about the weekend ahead, about the letter she needed to write to her younger brother Marcus, who was currently stationed at a forward operating base in Eastern Europe with their father's unit. Marcus was 18, barely a year younger than Kenna, but their father's latest deployment had been classified as too sensitive to include family members, leaving both siblings separated from their primary parent for the first time in their lives. Writing to Marcus had become Kenna's primary emotional outlet during her time in Denver. In her letters, she could express thoughts and feelings that she kept carefully controlled in her daily interactions. She could admit to missing the structure and certainty of military life, could describe the strange loneliness of living in a civilian community where no one understood the rhythms and requirements of military service. She was also planning to work on her American history project over the weekend, a research paper on the role of women in military service during the Afghanistan conflict. It was a topic that held personal significance for her, as several of the female soldiers she had known during her father's various postings had served in combat roles during that conflict. Some of them had returned home with stories of courage and sacrifice that had shaped Kenna's understanding of what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. The student parking lot was nearly empty by the time Kenna reached it, most of her classmates having departed earlier for weekend activities or after-school jobs. The few remaining vehicles were scattered across the large asphalt expanse, their owners presumably involved in sports practices or club meetings that would keep them at school for another hour or two. Kenna didn't own a car. Her grandmother had offered to help her buy one, but the expense seemed unnecessary for someone who would presumably be leaving for college in a few months. Instead, she took the city bus system, which ran regular routes between Roosevelt High and her grandmother's neighborhood. The walk to the bus stop was only a few blocks, and she actually enjoyed the brief period of solitude it provided between the social pressures of school and the awkward quietness of her grandmother's house. She was thinking about these things, her mind already shifting into weekend mode, when she became aware that she was no longer alone in the parking lot. Something in her peripheral vision, some movement that didn't match the normal patterns of students heading home for the weekend, made her turn slightly to assess the situation. Trent, Jake, and Drew were standing near the bike racks, their positioning suggesting that they had been waiting for her. This was unusual. Their harassment had typically been confined to school hours and school property during times when there were plenty of witnesses and adults nearby. The fact that they had chosen to confront her in the nearly empty parking lot suggested that something had changed, that they were planning something more serious than their usual campaign of low-level harassment. Kenna's training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting into the assessment mode that had been drilled into her through years of living on military installations where situational awareness was not just recommended, but required. She noted the positions of all three boys, the distances between them and her, the available exit routes from the parking lot, and the potential weapons or improvised weapons that might be available in the immediate environment. Most importantly, she assessed their likely intentions. The isolated location, the coordinated positioning, the fact that they had clearly planned this encounter rather than allowing it to develop spontaneously. All of these factors suggested that they were planning something more aggressive than their usual harassment. This was an escalation, and escalations in conflict situations require different response strategies than routine harassment. "Hey, Army girl," Trent called out as she approached, his voice carrying the familiar mocking tone, but with an undercurrent of something harder, more focused. "Nice jacket. Where'd you get it? The thrift store?" Kenna tried to step around them, but their positioning made it clear that this was not going to be allowed. Jake moved to block her path from the left, while Drew shifted to cut off her escape route to the right. They had her effectively cornered between the bike racks and the school building, with no easy way to avoid the confrontation they had planned. "I asked you a question," Trent continued, his voice taking on the harder edge that Kenna had been hearing more frequently in recent weeks. "Don't you think it's rude to ignore people when they're trying to be friendly?" The word friendly was delivered with such obvious sarcasm that it bordered on parody, but there was something in Trent's demeanor that suggested he was beyond caring about maintaining even the pretense of casual interaction. This felt different from their previous encounters, more focused and purposeful. "I just want to go home," Kenna said quietly, her voice steady despite the situation. She was assessing options, calculating possibilities, but she was also hoping that this could still be resolved without violence. "Please move," but Trent was clearly beyond listening to reasonable requests. Something about her continued composure, her refusal to show the fear or anger that he expected, had been eating at him for weeks. Every time she had failed to react to his harassment, every time she had maintained her dignity in the face of his attempts to humiliate her, had felt like a challenge to his authority and position in the school's social hierarchy. "You think you're so tough in this thing," he said, reaching out to grab the front of her jacket with both hands. "Let's see how tough you really are without your little costume." What happened next unfolded with a horrible inevitability that seemed to slow time itself. Trent yanked hard on the jacket, trying to pull it off her shoulders in a gesture that was part humiliation and part physical assault. The old leather, worn from years of military service and countless washings, couldn't withstand the sudden violence of his grip. The jacket tore along the back seam, the sound of ripping leather echoing off the school walls like a gunshot. But it was what fell out of the torn jacket that transformed the situation from a simple case of bullying into something far more serious. Military patches, medals, and commendations scattered across the asphalt like fallen leaves. A bronze star medal glinted in the afternoon sunlight. A purple heart rolled across the pavement. Multiple deployment patches from Iraq and Afghanistan lay scattered among combat infantry badges and airborne qualification insignia. The items had been carefully stored in an inner pocket of the jacket, wrapped in tissue paper like precious artifacts, and now they lay exposed and vulnerable on the cold asphalt of the school parking lot. Kenna dropped to her knees immediately, frantically gathering the scattered items with hands that shook for the first time since Trent had begun his campaign of harassment. For a moment, the careful composure that had defined her response to months of bullying cracked completely, revealing the depth of emotion she had been keeping under rigid control. Tears ran down her face as she clutched the bronze star medal against her chest. And when she spoke, her voice was broken in a way that made even Jake and Drew step backward involuntarily. "That was my brother's," she whispered, her words carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the parking lot. "He died in Afghanistan. That jacket, those medals, they were all I had left of him." The impact of her words hit the three boys like a physical blow. Trent stood frozen, the torn remnants of the jacket still clutched in his hands, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't just clothing he had destroyed, it was a memorial, a shrine to someone who had died in service to his country. Jake and Drew had backed away several steps, their faces pale with shock and the beginning of understanding. They had been participating in what they thought was typical teenage bullying, the kind of social dominance games that were played out in high schools across the country every day. But this was something different, something that crossed lines they hadn't even known existed. But Trent, perhaps overwhelmed by the sudden revelation of what his actions had caused, seemed to panic rather than apologize. Instead of acknowledging what he had done, instead of expressing regret or offering to help repair the damage, he doubled down on his cruelty in a way that would haunt him for years to come. "Well, maybe you shouldn't wear dead people's clothes to school," he said, his voice shaking, but still carrying that familiar edge of mockery. "It's kind of creepy, don't you think?" The cruelty of the comment, delivered in the face of Kenna's obvious grief and vulnerability, seemed to break something fundamental in the dynamics of the situation. It was as if Trent had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had said something so fundamentally wrong that it changed the nature of everything that would follow. Kenna looked up at him with eyes that were no longer filled with tears, but blazing with a fury that made all three boys take an involuntary step backward. The grief was still there, the pain of having her brother's memory desecrated, but it had transformed into something far more dangerous. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low and controlled, but carrying an undertone of menace that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "No idea at all." She stood up slowly, the torn jacket falling from Trent's nerveless fingers as she rose. As she moved, something fundamental seemed to change in her posture, in the way she carried herself. The timid slouch that had characterized her movement through the halls of Roosevelt High was gone, replaced by the bearing of someone who had been trained to stand at attention, to face down enemies far more dangerous than high school bullies. The transformation was dramatic enough that Jake and Drew found themselves unconsciously stepping backward, suddenly aware that they were no longer dealing with the quiet, passive victim they had been tormenting for months. This was someone different, someone whose controlled exterior had been masking capabilities that none of them had suspected. "You want to know about this jacket?" Kenna continued, her voice growing stronger and more controlled with each word. She was no longer the grief-stricken girl who had been scrambling to collect her brother's medals. This was someone who had found her center, who had remembered who she was and what she had been taught. "My brother earned every patch, every medal you just scattered across this parking lot like garbage." She began walking toward Trent, and there was something in her movement that made him realize he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't the uncertain shuffle of a victim retreating from conflict. This was the controlled advance of someone who had been trained to neutralize threats. "He served 3 tours in Afghanistan," she continued, still moving forward with that same measured pace. "He saved 6 men from an IED explosion outside Kandahar. He carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. He died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and he was 22 years old when it happened." Jake and Drew were backing away now, their instincts telling them that this situation had spiraled far beyond their understanding or control. They had signed up to help Trent hassle a quiet girl, not to participate in desecrating the memory of a fallen soldier. The magnitude of what they had been involved in was beginning to sink in, and neither of them wanted any part of what was about to happen. But Trent, whether from shock, pride, or simple inability to process what was happening, seemed frozen in place. He stood there, holding the torn remnants of the jacket, watching Kenna approach with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "So what?" he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence and his hands were visibly shaking. "That doesn't give you the right to act like you're better than everyone else." Kenna stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the controlled fury in her dark eyes, close enough that he could sense the coiled tension in her slight frame. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and measured, but it carried an authority that made it clear the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I have been acting like I'm better than you, but that's because I am better than you. I'm better than someone who would destroy something that means everything to someone else just to feel powerful for a few minutes." The words were delivered without anger, without dramatic emphasis, but with a quiet certainty that was more devastating than any shouted accusation could have been. They carried the weight of absolute conviction, the kind of moral authority that comes from having clear principles and the courage to stand by them. "I'm better than someone who thinks strength means picking on people who can't fight back," she continued, still in that same controlled tone. "I'm better than someone who gets his sense of worth by making others feel worthless. And I'm definitely better than someone who would mock the sacrifice of a soldier who died serving his country." Trent tried to respond, to maintain some vestige of his usual dominance, but the words wouldn't come. Something in Kenna's presence, in the way she carried herself, had stripped away his ability to maintain the facade of control that had served him so well throughout his high school career. "You want to know what else?" Kenna asked, taking another step closer. "I've been holding back this whole time. Not because I'm scared of you, but because I was taught that strength should be used to protect people, not to hurt them. My brother taught me that. My father taught me that. Every soldier I've ever known has taught me that." She was close enough now that Trent could see the controlled fury in her eyes, could sense the kind of training that allowed someone to remain calm and focused even in the midst of intense emotion. This wasn't the wild anger of a typical teenage fight. This was something far more disciplined and therefore far more dangerous. "But you just crossed a line that I can't ignore," she continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume, but somehow carrying more menace than any shouted threat. "You destroyed something sacred to me, something that represented everything my brother stood for, and then you mocked his sacrifice." Without warning, she moved. Not with the wild telegraphed swings of an angry teenager, but with the precise economical movements of someone who had been trained in hand-to-hand combat by experts. Her techniques were not those learned in weekend martial arts classes or picked up from movies, but the practical, effective methods taught to military personnel who might need to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. Her first move was devastatingly simple. She stepped inside Trent's reach before he could react and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over and leave him gasping for air. The strike was perfectly placed, targeting the bundle of nerves just below the sternum that would cause maximum discomfort while minimizing the risk of permanent injury. Before Trent could recover from the first strike, Kenna had grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back in a control hold that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm and forced him to his knees on the asphalt. The hold was applied with textbook precision, using leverage and pressure points rather than brute strength to achieve complete dominance over her much larger opponent. "This is called a compliance hold," she explained in a conversational tone, as if she were giving a classroom demonstration rather than subduing someone who had been tormenting her for months. "It's designed to control someone without permanently damaging them. The more you struggle, the more it hurts." Jake and Drew had started forward instinctively when they saw their friend go down, but Kenna's eyes snapped to them with such intensity that they froze in their tracks. There was something in her gaze that made it clear she was completely aware of their positions, their capabilities, and their likely intentions. "I wouldn't," she said calmly, her voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "I can handle all three of you if I have to, but I'd prefer not to. Your friend here has learned his lesson, haven't you, Trent?" Trent was gasping and trying to nod, the pain in his arm making it impossible to maintain any pretense of defiance. He was completely at her mercy, held in place by someone who weighed probably 60 pounds less than he did, but who clearly possessed skills he had never imagined. Around them, other students had begun to gather. Word of the confrontation had spread through the school's informal communication network, and teenagers who had been attending after-school activities or club meetings had begun drifting toward the parking lot to witness what was happening. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, fascination, and disbelief as they watched the quiet girl they had all dismissed demonstrate capabilities that none of them had suspected. "I want you to understand something," Kenna continued, still maintaining the hold that kept Trent immobilized. "I could have done this any time over the past 3 months. I could have ended your little game the first day you decided to make me your target. But I didn't, because I was taught that violence should be a last resort, used only when all other options have been exhausted." She increased the pressure slightly, causing Trent to gasp and struggle against the hold. "I was taught that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves, not from hurting people who are weaker than you." I was taught that a soldier's duty is to serve something larger than themselves, not to use their training to dominate others. The gathered students were completely silent now, watching a demonstration of controlled violence unlike anything they had ever seen. This wasn't the wild, chaotic fighting of typical teenage conflicts. This was something disciplined, purposeful, and absolutely overwhelming in its effectiveness. "But you made a choice," Kenna continued, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "You chose to destroy something that represented my brother's service, his sacrifice, his memory. You chose to mock the death of someone who gave his life protecting others, and that's a choice that has consequences." She released the hold suddenly and stepped back, allowing Trent to slump forward onto the asphalt. But she wasn't finished with him yet. "Stand up," she commanded, and something in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a request, but an order delivered by someone who expected immediate compliance. Trent struggled to his feet, his face pale and his breathing still labored from the encounter. He was looking at Kenna with an expression that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time, understanding that everything he had thought he knew about her had been wrong. "You destroyed something that belonged to my brother," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot and reaching every student who had gathered to watch. Something that represented his service, his courage, his willingness to sacrifice everything for people he had never met. "You did it because you thought I was weak, because you thought I wouldn't fight back." She paused, letting the words sink in not just for Trent, but for every student who was watching. "You were wrong about me being weak, but you were right about me not wanting to fight. I don't enjoy hurting people, even people who deserve it. That's what separates me from bullies like you." The accusation was delivered without anger or dramatic emphasis, but with a quiet conviction that was more damaging than any emotional outburst could have been. It carried the weight of moral authority, the kind of certainty that comes from having clear principles and the courage to act on them. "I want you to pick up every piece of my brother's jacket," she continued, her voice steady and authoritative. "Every medal, every patch, every scrap of leather. And then I want you to apologize, not to me, but to his memory." Trent looked like he wanted to argue, to maintain some vestige of his former dominance, but something in Kenna's eyes made it clear that his options were extremely limited. He was no longer the predator in this relationship. If anything, their positions had been completely reversed. He knelt down slowly and began gathering the scattered items, his movements clumsy and desperate. The Bronze Star medal glinted in the afternoon sunlight as he picked it up with shaking hands. The Purple Heart seemed impossibly heavy as he added it to the growing collection in his palms. Each patch, each ribbon, each symbol of military service felt like an accusation against his own behavior. Jake and Drew remained frozen in place, suddenly understanding that their friend had picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than any of them had realized. The girl they had helped torment for months wasn't just quiet, she was controlled, disciplined, and capable of violence that was both precise and devastating. As Trent handed her the gathered items, Kenna took them with the same careful reverence she had shown when she first knelt to collect them. She examined each medal, each patch, as if she were seeing them for the first time. Her hands were steady now, no longer shaking with grief or anger, but moving with the controlled precision of someone who had regained her center. "My brother's name was Marcus," she said quietly, holding the Bronze Star medal up so that it caught the light. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Daniel Voss, United States Army. He was awarded this medal for actions above and beyond the call of duty during Operation Enduring Freedom." She looked at each of the three boys in turn, her dark eyes holding theirs until they looked away. "He was leading a patrol outside Kandahar when they hit an IED. The explosion killed 2 soldiers instantly and wounded 4 others. Marcus could have called for evacuation and waited for backup, but he didn't. He went back into the kill zone 6 times to pull wounded men to safety." The silence in the parking lot was absolute now. Even students who had been talking quietly among themselves had fallen silent, drawn into the story of courage and sacrifice that Kenna was telling. The sixth time he went back, there was a secondary explosion, she continued, her voice never wavering despite the emotion behind the words. He was killed instantly, but not before he had saved every wounded member of his patrol. 6 men are alive today because my brother chose to risk everything to protect them. She held up the Purple Heart, the medal catching the afternoon sunlight like a prism. This medal represents the wounds he sustained in the service of his country. He was hit by shrapnel during his second deployment, but he refused medical evacuation because his unit was short-staffed and he didn't want to leave his men. Trent was staring at the medals in her hands with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. These weren't just pieces of metal and fabric, they were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and service that represented values he had never been forced to confront. He taught me that strength isn't about dominating other people, Kenna said, her voice growing stronger with each word. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you everything. She carefully wrapped the medals and patches back in their tissue paper, treating each item with the reverence due to sacred objects. These medals don't belong to me. They belong to every soldier who has ever served, every family that has ever sacrificed, every person who has ever chosen to put their life on the line for others. When she looked back at Trent, her expression had softened slightly, but her voice still carried the authority of someone who had found her moral center and intended to defend it. "You could learn from his example," she said quietly. "You could learn what real strength looks like, what real courage means. You could learn that using your size and social position to hurt people who can't fight back isn't strength, it's cowardice." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at all 3 boys. "This ends here. You leave me alone, you leave other people alone, and maybe you'll learn what it means to be worthy of the freedom that soldiers like my brother died to protect." The threat was delivered in the same calm, controlled tone she had used throughout the confrontation, but it carried a weight that made all 3 boys nod quickly. They had seen what she was capable of when pushed beyond her breaking point, and none of them wanted to discover what other skills she might possess. "But if you ever, and I mean ever, decide to target someone else the way you targeted me," she continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume, but somehow carrying more menace than any shouted threat, "you'll discover that I have a lot more training than what you saw today, and next time I might not be so restrained." As Kenna walked away from the parking lot, the crowd of students parted before her like water. The transformation was complete and absolute. No longer the quiet girl who had tried to disappear into the background, but someone who commanded respect through strength, discipline, and unshakable moral authority. She walked with the measured stride of someone who had remembered who she was and what she stood for, someone who would never again allow herself to be diminished by people who confused cruelty with strength. The torn jacket was beyond repair, but she carried her brother's medals with a dignity that transformed her from victim to victor, from target to protector. Behind her, Trent knelt on the asphalt of the parking lot, surrounded by the scattered pieces of his former dominance and the growing understanding that he had picked a fight with someone whose strength came from sources he had never imagined. The lesson he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. A reminder that real power comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when such power is necessary, and the restraint to use it only when all other options have been exhausted.